everyone, and welcome back to our second panel. My name is Orli Fridman, and I will be moderating the panel, which I think, by the request of the organizers, will last until 1:45 for all of us before we take a break. The title of our second panel is Memory and Historical Analogies in World Politics, and we have 3 papers and 1 discussant that will take us through the next hour and plus. I thought just before we take the first paper, I want to pick up from the comment that was made by Ayse as a discussant in the last panel, and maybe relate to this idea that indeed many scholars and students, and I don't think only in North America, but also in European academic institutes, can go through their whole academic careers without any reference to memory studies or social memory studies, where we mostly, I would say, focus the discussions as understood today. And we are now, I would say, more than 2 decades after what we refer to in social memory studies as the memory boom. And so it was very interesting to see the choice of the focus of this academic day and the panels and the discussions and the bridges between IR scholars and social memory studies scholars as something interesting for us to explore here today. And so our first paper by Ayse Zarakol is titled Historical Analogies and Making Nonsense of the Rise of the Rest, and Ayse is at the University of Cambridge, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief since you've already indulged me. This paper comes out of my time. I spent 1 year in Washington, D.C. During the 2012-13 academic year. I had a fellowship that took me out of academia and placed me on the Hill working for the US Congress. More specifically, I was working for the Congressional Research Service, which is kind of like a public think tank that is in the service of US congressmen. If they have any questions, they need background, they need testimony, they call up on the service, and the experts there basically write memos and reports giving the background. And it's supposed to be nonpartisan, it's supposed to be not take any positions on issues, but just the facts as to the extent that's possible. Once I got there, they didn't know quite what to do with me, so I was given the task of, I was helping with memos on Turkey and so on, but my primary task was to do research on rising powers. So this is 2012. By that time, as I discuss in the paper, everybody in Washington, D.C., every think tank was writing about the BRICS, the rising powers. So the Congressional Research Service wanted there to be some kind of, culmination of this research. So I actually spent the year reading all this, what's called the gray literature, what the think tanks produce. And I, because I had all this time in my hands, I think read everything that there is, of the major think tanks, and I, counted them. And what I found is interesting. So the term BRIC was coined in 2001 by a Goldman Sachs financial analyst, Jim O'Neill, predicting that these were the, Brazil, Russia, India, China were the hot new economies. This is the place to invest. So it was an economic investment kind of prediction. Then, because I think the acronym was so catchy, and Jelena and I have done some work on branding, and I think the acronym figures into that. The acronym took kind of a life of its own, and the BRIC countries liked this idea that there should be a bloc. They started meeting in the middle of the decade and formed a formal organization. As you know, in 2010, South Africa applied for admission, so now they are officially the BRICS. But what's interesting is in the US foreign policy, there's almost no interest in the BRICS as BRICS in the first half of the decade. So if you look at think tank products, and also when I say think tanks, I'm counting both public and private. There's like nothing written about this. Nothing. And then suddenly 2007, there are a few reports, BRICS, the world is changing, rise of the rest. And then 2009, 2010, it's a huge jump. And suddenly everybody is writing about it. And I traced this in the paper. And I haven't had a chance to go back and update my records, but I've been following it. And my general impression is that this interest is tapering off as we speak. So because of what's happening in Ukraine and what's happening with ISIS, so the worries about Chinese economy going bust and so on. So the talk of town is no longer the rise of the rest or rise of China, but really other things, return of old geopolitical problems in a way. So what we're looking at is a period of roughly 5 years where the American foreign policy establishment kind of lost its head around this, this hyped up thing that was happening, rise of the rest, rise of BRICS, and everybody was trying to coin acronyms. Other countries got on the bandwagon. You have MIST, which is Mexico, Indonesia, South Korea, and Turkey, or MINT. Nigeria, I guess, sometimes isn't there. TIMBY, I don't know. So there are many acronyms. Obviously, the countries that are put up to be candidates for rising really like this. They, also put funding into think tanks that issue these reports, kind of like this, self-feeding, self-perpetuating circle of research. So. So I found this very interesting because everybody was writing about it. Everybody was writing as if it is definitely a thing that's happening. Well, I should qualify that. Everybody was writing about it as a thing that's separate from the analysis. So it's as if this is a physical phenomena that's happening out there. We're in DC, we're writing these reports. The people in these countries don't read these reports that are written about them. We pretend that there isn't this, exchange of information, that they don't shape their behavior around these, these reports that are being issued in the DC and so on. And when you look at the academic literature, it actually follows the same pattern. The academic literature on rising powers, well, it's either a historical, there's this realist literature on rise and fall of great powers, or the current literature, it's very oriented towards international political economy. Again, this is happening, how do we manage this, and so on. So I didn't find, in all the reading that I did, any kind of critical distance, which is what I want to bring to this issue. So if we believe that our memories, analogies, the things that we say, these have shaping effects on the world, then certainly this frenzy around this hyped up concept of rising powers, it's something that's worthy of critical study also. So I've launched on this actually a very big historical project about this, but in this particular paper, I'm looking at the different attitudes that I see in American foreign policy establishment, and I categorize those into 4 basic veins. And I make the argument that these attitudes don't really tell us anything about what's happening with China. These reports are not revealing about China. You can't read a think tank report issued in DC and learn about China. What you learn is what US is worried about and what US expects will happen. So the reports are much more revealing about the US than they are about China, and I think that's how they should be studied. So if you look at this literature, what you find are 4 attitudes, and in the paper I give them playful names that I borrow from various films and pop culture, but I realize not everybody may be familiar with those, so I will just summarize. So there's one attitude, which I call the Lord Grantham attitude. So if you've seen Downton Abbey, so this attitude is we don't need to be worried about rising powers because we're not really declining. You know, US will always be kind of at the top. So there's that attitude. Then there's the attitude, they may be rising, but they will never rise enough to catch up with us, which I characterize by reference to the movie Princess Bride. But anyway, so this attitude is kind of a condescending attitude. They may do okay, you know, China may do okay, but it will never be the US. It's kind of, and these are actually the attitudes I would expect to see. You know, any kind of country in a power position, if they're threatened or if they perceive some kind of competition, you would expect them to dismiss or downplay this. You know, we have many historical analogies, speaking of this, of these attitudes. The third, actually, what is the predominant attitude in the foreign policy establishment is what I find surprising, which is this hopeful, idealizing attitude about rising power. So if you read the think tank literature and also a lot of the academic literature you know, about rising powers, it makes the argument that the rising powers will be great for the international system. Multipolarity will be great for the international system. And this is why I think we see many of these reports after the financial crisis. China will share burdens of global governance. That you know, there will be some kind of healthy balance, different cultures represented. So there's this, you know, very idealized construct of rising powers, with the exception of Russia. This is a special case, but with the others, Brazil, India, to some extent the smaller ones, Turkey, you know, Indonesia, they're idealized as like helpers. So this is, I think, what is very interesting. You know, we don't expect that a power that is threatened will idealize its competitors, and I think I don't really have a very good answer to why this is happening. Part of it, I think, is because the US hasn't completely, Americans have not completely accepted that they're in decline, and you know, this type of idealization of secondary actors you see when people are speaking from a position of power. So some of it is still speaking from a position of power, but also, as I try to argue in the paper, it's also the memory of America's own rise and the construction of that narrative as a very benign and something that's good for the international. Americans, you know, remember it as this way, that it was very good for the international system, it was good for the previous hegemon, Britain, etc. Because they remember their own rise in this way, I think they're projecting into the future in this way. And then a fourth attitude, which doesn't exist in foreign policy circles, but to some extent in academia, is that these countries will rise, and then they will, you know, take kind of like a revenge. You know, they will, you know, right the wrongs that the West has committed against the East, and so on. So those are the four attitudes, yeah, I think I think this is how like rising powers should be studied, as opposed to taking it for granted that this is certainly something that's happening. But I'll stop there, and we'll talk more in Q&A.
Okay. Thank you, Ayse. Our next paper is by Elizaveta Gaufman, who is at the Eberhard-Karls-Universität, and the paper's title is Memory of Fascism in Russia, Social Media During the Crisis in Ukraine.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. Voila. And I will be talking about memory of fascism in Russia during the crisis in Ukraine. And specifically, I will concentrate on the memory of fascism on social networks in Russia. So it's a kind of a digital memory of fascism that exists right now in Russia. So first up, I need to note that World War II is remembered differently in Russia. It's not World War II, it's a Great Patriotic War, which is in itself another collective memory reference to Patriotic War of 1812, so the war against Napoleon. And by naming it a Great Patriotic War, it makes an emphasis on existential nature of the war against fascism. So in a sense, it was a World War II 2.0 on Russian social networks, because the users on social networks are trying to show how Russians are fighting fascism or Nazism over again. So it's another installment of the World War II on Russian social networks. Also, the battle for the hearts and mind was going on social networks as well. Even there's a Russian internet meme that's called Sofa Warriors of Sofa Troops, Divanные войска, meaning that the people were fighting for the battle for Ukraine, for their own position on their sofas and not actually engaging in the conflict itself. So I would like to start with outlining my talk. So I'll have 3 sections. The first is that I'll just briefly talk about the theoretical background that I'm dealing here. And then I'll present my evidence that I collected on Russian social networks Vkontakte, LiveJournal, and Twitter. So there are 3 major social networks that provide the most material. Unfortunately, Facebook is not always very accessible due to privacy settings. And at the end, I will draw some conclusions of my research. So we also, in the previous panel, it was noted that there is some kind of mobilizing narratives. And fascism is one of those narratives. When we talk about fascism, we talk about atrocities, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes. So it's a kind of a guiding discourse that makes people react in a very emotive way towards it. So if we frame the conflict in Ukraine as with this guiding fascist narrative, it makes people react in a certain way and makes the reaction much more emotional. And it also makes people react in terms of security. So we're talking about the existential threat narrative here as well. So the fascist threat is an existential threat to a lot of Russians, and it is still due to the fact that the Great Patriotic War memory is being very much encouraged now, especially under Putin. So there's increased celebrations of the Victory Day. There are parades which did not actually take place since, well, before 1996. So the kind of increased celebrations of the Great Patriotic War led to the fact that the memory of fascism and the defeat of fascism, most importantly, is very vital to the new Russian identity, so to speak. And when we talk about fascism discourse, it's not just a uniquely Russian phenomenon. So if we talk about American, for example, context, there's a lot of Republican Party members would call Obama Hitler, or like in the previous panel it was noted that Nasser was called Hitler, or Saddam Hussein was called Hitler. So this kind of invoking the fascist discourse, it's very common technique, so to say, in a lot of contexts. But apart from actually framing the conflict and this existential threat narratives, it's also important to embed this discourse in something that's familiar to the society, so they would know that this is the existential threat that they had to deal with. And when we talk about fascism in Russia, the memory of fascism is connected to the whole existence. So this is a very pivotal narrative in the Russian identity, and it's very important to construct it in such a way that people will remember, or actually if they physically cannot remember it, because it's a post-memory phenomenon. So most people are actually familiar with the Great Patriotic War through narratives or through media, film, so they don't know actually what happened. And there was a very very big memorial work that was carried out in Soviet times and also in the modern Russia times in order to create some kind of more uniformal narrative of the Great Patriotic War. So when we talk about digital memories, it's more of real-time memory mediation. Memory is not stable, especially collective memory. So it's a subject to change, and if we take a look at the social networks, we can actually observe this process in real time. So we see how pro-Russian or pro-Ukrainian supporters clash on social networks, how they use the different narratives in order to propose their own position. And in the data that I collected for this paper, I analyzed the 3 networks that I mentioned in the introduction, and there are several narratives that are existent. So first of all, the word fascism was mentioned numerous times on not just social networks, but also mainstream media. So there is a service called Integrum Worldwide. It registers the mentions of certain terms on mass media. and it registered a huge spike since the beginning of Euromaidan in Ukraine. So actually, by tracing the dynamics of the mentioning of fascism on mass media, it's possible to see the Russian engagement with the topic. So for example, one of the biggest spikes was registered in March, so when the Crimea was reunified with Russia, as the pro-Russian people would say, or next, but as Ukrainian position would go. And also, the way people talk about the conflict in Ukraine is very indicative of their own position as well. So for example, Russian mass media and social network users, they have a pro-Russian position. They use the word opolchenцы, which means militiamen, to refer to the separatists in eastern Ukraine. And this is another memory, collective memory reference. So this is a reference to the 17th century fight against the Polish-Lithuanian invasion. So this is another collective memory reference of fighting off the foreign threat, so to say. And it's also important to note that there is an anti-governmental position on Russian social networks as well. And probably it's only possible on social networks because in mainstream mass media it's hardly possible to witness that kind of discourse. So that kind of discourse can be termed Colorado discourse because of the St. George's ribbon, which is black and orange, and it's the colors of the Colorado pest beetle. So the people who want to kind of insult the pro-Russian separatists, they would call them Colorados, to invoke this existential threat of a pest, but also to say that how increasingly negative they are for the population in Ukraine. Another term that was also used was Luganda, to indicate the low level of development of the people who are in the Luhansk, the People's Republic. Another interesting narrative that is connected to fascism is framing of the EU actually as the Fourth Reich. So this might come as a surprise to a lot of to a European, Western European audience, but a lot of Russians actually see European Union integration as an expansion. So it's a kind of a quest for Lebensraum in a way, and a lot of visual material that I collected actually reflected that point of view. So a lot of them actually, a lot of users posted some kind of World War II pictures of Nazi prisoners of war and connected it to the and called them Euro integrators, for example. So this is a very, so they wanted to indicate the forced nature of the integration and something that the population of Ukraine does not want. So this is another reference to fascism in this case. And there is also, the fascist discourse was not only used by the pro-Russian commentators, it was also used by pro-Ukrainian commentators. So during those clashes that I observed on Twitter especially, the way Putin, for example, was called Putler, to have the connection with Hitler. His youth organizations were called Putin Jugend, so to make this kind of connection that these youth organizations that are very active in this promoting this pro-governmental discourse, to make them resemble the youth organizations in Nazi Germany. And also another term that was popular among the pro-Ukrainian commentators was Rashism, to indicate the fascism and that is emanating from Russia. So basically both sides of the conflict were trying to promulgate this kind of fascist parallel. And it often ended up with so-called holy wars, the kind of protracted discussions on the internet where none of the sides actually wanted to change their mind. They were just, it was the argument for the sake of argument in a way. And a relatively new phenomenon that I observed was the fact that the support for the pro-Russian separatists in the eastern Ukraine was mainly to observe in nationalist groups as well. So it's a new phenomenon because before, for example, in 2010, 2011, when during the race riots in Moscow, Putin was seen as a sort of a traitor for the nationalists, for the Russian racist movement. But now with the reunification of Crimea, he was actually seen more as a role model. And as well as the sociological services note that his rating is shooting through the roof, so it's 87% approval rating for Putin. That never happened before. And a lot of evidence that I collected actually comes from very much nationalist, racist groups on social networks, especially Kontakte, which is a very useful tool for mobilization among kind of ultra-Nazi groups in Russia. So that's actually the way they mobilize for different campaigns where they hunt foreigners or non-Slavic looking people, which in their own definition. And it's also interesting to note that, for example, the referendum in Crimea was actually monitored by several representatives of nationalist parties from Europe. So, for example, from Jobbik party, the Hungarian ultra-nationalist party, from Front National, and from Vlaams Belang. So this is actually European parties, and that's actually a fact that was heralded by Russian media, that, oh, see, the Europeans are actually monitoring the referendum in Crimea. So there's like this sort of lending legitimacy to the whole annexation process in a way. So in conclusion, I would just like to note that Great Patriotic War is a very powerful collective memory reference in Russia. And it actually probably one of the reasons that there is such a huge support for Putin and for the actions in Crimea, so-called Krym Nash, Crimea is ours movement, that is very popular on social networks as a hashtag, for example. And it also shows that there is even though there is a variability of the discourse of social networks, but it might not be representative of the whole population, because social network users represent only a fraction of the Russian population. So it's probably about 50 million out of 140 million of the Russian population. So it's a kind of a limitation for my research, but on the other hand, it represents an interesting discussion on fascism and collective memory in Russia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And I think indeed those mnemonic battles or battles about memory are additional, not only fascinating sites for research, but also kind of sites of conflict if we look at Ukraine right now, or of course any other conflict or post-conflict society we look into. Our next presenter is Dominica Wozniak from the University of Warsaw, and her paper is titled Poland's Re-Entry into International Society and the Sway of Memories of the Long Polish Golden Age.
Thank you very much. Well, I will try to make it as brief as possible, because this is just a starting point to the whole research. Well, the main argument of my paper is that during the process of re-entry into the international society, and mostly the process of reapproachment to the core of international society, which took place after 1918, Poland made use of its memory of Polish Golden Age. Well, since to me the process of the re-entry to the international society leaves not so many doubts, I decided to focus more on the latter process, the process of social advancement in the international society. Well, to make this such an analysis possible, it was, of course, clear to me that I had to acknowledge the hierarchical vision, acknowledge the vision of hierarchical structure of international society, and concern it as consisting of the, let's say, social classes of society, of states. Well, the latter category is to me the outcome of two variables, which the first one is power of the state, and the second is the international image of the state. Those two variables placed Poland in the interwar period in the outer tier of international society, or in the lower class of it. To advance within international society, Polish politicians tried to increase the power of states during the Paris Peace Conference, and later during the military effort of Polish-Soviet war. Well, the question of Poland's perception by great powers or the self-concept of the nation itself was also visible in the process of social advancement, but I think it's not that significant for at this time, and if I have just 15 minutes to tell you about it, that I will leave it somewhere else. Well, regaining its former role in European society of states, I mean former role, that means the role which Poland played during the Polish Golden Age, has been set as the vital interest of Polish interwar politics. Well, to justify their claims of restitution of former Poland, Polish politicians employed in their discourse the myths of long Polish Golden Age, and this period, which I call long Polish Golden Age, refers to 16th and 17th century. However, it is not common practice to delineate it this way. I just chose this period because it's the starting point of the self-concept, considering Poland and Polish people as magnificent, and also because it is the last such successful period in Polish history, and at the same time it's the last point of reference to Poland as a fully independent state in the past. Well, during this long Polish Golden Age, Poland and even what I said, it may be regarded as a mnemonic technique, because it was not a Poland, it was a Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth became the largest kingdom in Europe at the time, stretching from modern-day Silesia to Kiev and from Estonia to Moldavia. It reached almost 1 million square kilometers. The population numbered 11 million people. The country was perceived as a political, military, and also economic power, thanks to the grain and wood export to Western Europe. And beside its military triumphs, the kingdom developed its political clout on the basis of emerging political system, which was nobles' democracy. Well, the nobility, the Szlachta, was the de facto sovereign and identified itself with the nation, although it comprised only of 8 to 10% of the whole population. The system of the nobles' democracy has been set on the basis of Henrician articles, which was the permanent contract between the nobility and the newly elected king that stated the fundamental principles of governance and constitutional law in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Well, these articles granted some very important rights to the nobility, such as personal inviolability, the law of resistance against the king, the rule of parliament, the liberum veto, or the freedom of religion. Well, shortly after, this system of legal rights and privileges started to be known as the Golden Liberty in Poland, and turned out to be the first of sources of national pride to Polish people, or to the nation comprising of the nobility. Well, at the time when most European countries headed towards centralization, absolute monarchy, religious and dynastic warfare, the Commonwealth distinguished itself with decentralization, confederation, democracy, and religious tolerance. Well, the latter one, this religious tolerance, along with the ban of the throne inheritance, eliminated to the great extent military conflicts inside the kingdom, and resulted in the self-conviction of nobility of its rather peaceful nation. On this basis, Polish thinkers of the time of Polish Golden Age quite often therefore looked down on France or Spain due to their imperfect political system. However, at the same time, the character of the customs and the customs of Western Europe, when they were confronted with this idealized vision of Polish reality, have never denied the conviction of common basis of culture. On the other hand, when it comes to the comparisons between Poland and other non-European, non-European polities, these differences were considered as the epitome of tyranny, threatening the golden liberty of Polish nobility. And this image, it is, I think, important, was used after as a condition to regard Poland as the bulwark of Europe, because Szlachta thought that it is about to stand guard on over the European values confronted with Asian despotism. Well, during the Golden Age, Poland may be therefore characterized by three dogmas of self-concept manifested by nobility. Well, the first is that Poland is the bulwark of Europe and is the defender of Christian Europe and later the European civilization. Then Poland feeds Europe. And the third one, that Poland has the perfect political system which implements liberty, the fundamental value of European order. In the age of the state's absence, it was 123 years after the partitions of Poland, which the last took place in 1795. Those three features rose to the role of the national mythology, which helped on the one hand to explain the tragic events and on the other to bring the heralds of better times. I think that it seems natural that the nation which loses its statehood resorts to mirages. And in the Polish case, this function was performed by romantic and post-romantic vision of the nation's past. It was built according to beliefs typical for the epoch, emphasizing the national features and divine mission given to Poland by Providence. Elements of historical memory such as that Poland is a bulwark of Europe, connected with the conviction of its divine mission in the name of freedom, started to be used as the argument for restitution of Poland. They also helped to shape the cohesive idea of the restitution of old-time Poland, which in the aftermath informed to the great extent the Polish foreign policy after the Great War. As I mentioned at the beginning, the existence of strong Poland was the goal in as much as the independent in itself. To make it, it seems necessary to Polish politicians to push back the wheel of the history up to the moment when Poland was military and cultural power in the Eastern Europe. Well, Polish politicians knew that what may be granted by great powers during the Paris Peace Conference do not meet their expectations. So, as I said before, these claims were justified on the basis of historical memory. Firstly, as I try to draw your attention to this point, the Second Polish Republic was perceived as the continuation of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The early interwar Poland has been perceived not only as the rightful inheritor of the former state, but it was exactly identified with it despite many significant differences between Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and Second Polish Republic. Well, on this basis, Polish politicians, the Polish delegates to the Paris Peace Conference, were prepared to invoke in the course of negotiations the historical right of Polish nation to certain territory and its former function among the nations of Europe. And what best, to me, presents these established assumptions is the instruction conveyed for delegates by the Chief of State, Marshal Piłsudski, and his idea posited as following. The borders of future Poland should secure its expansion towards east and fulfilling their colonization. Poland must set the expedient and permanent boundary in the east. It should include Lithuania, Pinsk, western part of Volhynia and terrains of central Galicia. Lithuania should be united with Poland due to the necessity of its colonization, historical community, common religious tradition, and finally because of loads of cultural education given to it by Poles. Polish influences in Lithuania are currently the only support for this country against Bolshevism, and if we are not able to strengthen it as a barrier, the deluge of Bolshevism to these countries is certain. Well, the references to the former territory of the kingdom, its civilizing mission, and the slightly rewarded role of Poland as the bulwark of Europe, defending Europe from not now from the despotism of Asian politics, but from Bolshevism this time, are therefore easy to recognize in this part. Such claims were also spread during the Paris Peace Conference by the Polish Bureau of Congressional Task and private initiative in propagandist brochures. However, this try failed completely. Neither the postulates of Polish delegation in Paris nor the propaganda meet the expected ends. Since the western border of Poland was defined permanently in Paris, the problem of eastern ones was to be solved by military effort. The ideas of both statesmen, Józef Piłsudski and Roman Dmowski, and why I am emphasizing those two names is that these were the politicians who had completely different political idea and political claims in the internal politics. Well, to these both statesmen, the fight for eastern borderlands was the fight for recovering former power of the country by regaining both the rightful territory and the traditional sphere of influence of Polish cultural cultural influence. Well, enrichment, the power of the country of these components were to guarantee the social advancement within international society, both, as I said, in the visions of Piłsudski and Dmowski. Well, as only the first one has the direct influence on foreign policy of Poland, I will try to just briefly present you what was his idea. Well, the primary goal of Piłsudski at this time was to create the Eastern Empire, or the Polish Empire of Dominions, which would unite territories of Poland, Lithuania, Belarus and Ukraine. The union of these nations was about to form an alternative for Russian domination in the region. But Piłsudski knew that would maybe granted by the treaty, and that the resolutions of the treaty will deter his plan. Nevertheless, he decided to take a military effort and to engage in the Polish-Soviet war, which to me was stepping out to such level of self-reliance, which have not been ascribed to it to Poland from over 100 of years, and I think it is the important step towards regaining the power, or regaining the former political clout. So, as we know, the both attempts to restore the former shape of Poland failed. Both the negotiations of Paris Peace Conference and the Polish-Soviet War. And what might summarize best these events and this failure is also are also the words of Piłsudski for the third time, I think. And after a few years, after the end of the Polish-Soviet War, he said during his lecture that the perception of the world has been based only on the relatively recent past, which testified against us. The whole world was of the opinion that all Polish claims towards territories eastward Bug River are aggression, that those territories are entitled to Russia. 100 years of captivity, which we conquered, left its mark not only in us, but also in the masters of this world. So I think that best summarizes it and explains the events again on the basis of historical memory. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dominika, and at least parts of your presentation made me think about literature and social memory studies and the way we organize, or groups or nations organize their past, and Aviatar Zubovel's work on time maps and the organization of not only our calendars but our pasts is always related to the present very much, is part of what I'm taking from your presentation. Our discussant, Jelena Subotić, was introduced already in the last panel, but from the Georgia State University. I didn't know which one comes first, the state or the university. So please, your
mutually constituted relationship. Okay, so I'm going to kind of follow Ayse's lead in the previous panel. I'm going to first talk a little bit about something in general, and then that actually came out from the first panel, and then I'll say a few words about the individual papers. So the first thing is what we discussed in the earlier panel is whether there's any use in employing historical analogies as a methodological technique, and how we get easily annoyed and frustrated when policymakers use wrong analogies and they draw wrong lessons. And they always do that. There's never been one, come up with something where you said, that was a fantastic analogy and the policy that was created out of that analogy is something that I support. That has never happened. So we, I think, agree that the political use of historical analogies is very problematic and questionable and can lead to suboptimal outcomes. But I'm also wondering whether the opposite of that would be treating each case as unique, and treating each crisis as unique, and treating each country as unique. And so not saying that crisis A is like crisis B in the past, but it's a new, unique experience that has never happened before, and that we need to come up with new solutions from scratch. And I find it somewhat equally annoying when I read about countries being unique and countries' problems being unique. And all of the countries that we studied here, I've read about them being unique. And Serbia is unique, and Croatia is unique, and Turkey is unique, and the US is very unique. And oh boy, Israel is incredibly unique. And you can never possibly compare it to anything else because of its unique experience. So I think there's a downside in rejecting the use of historical analogies and kind of learning from the past in unicization, which is a word I just made up, of each individual country's experience. So I don't have any solutions in life or in general, but I wonder if there's a way to kind of bridge this aversion to uniqueness and an aversion to historical analogies in a way that would solve some of these problems. The second general point I want to make is, again, from the first panel and then from all the papers we heard in this panel, the use of historical analogies and the historicization tells us more about the speaker and the writer of that narrative than about the case that's being analogized against. So we learn more about, so Ayse was talking about the rising powers thing, we learn more about the US than we do about rising powers when we look at historicization in contemporary politics. So if that's the case, if we do learn more about the writer, the speaker, the constructor and creator of the narrative than we do about the object of the narrative, then maybe that is going to be the angle that I am approaching the three papers. And that's going to be my question for each of the papers. In other words, what did we learn about the creator of the narrative, the writer and speaker of the narrative, more than the object of the narrative? And so Ayse's paper, I think, is the most explicit in this space by making a claim that really we learn about contemporary American anxieties, insecurities, worries, and not really anything about China that we didn't know before. But if that's the case, and I think that is the case, what then specifically did I learn about US reflexive memory? Or what specifically, what are these anxieties? So if you can flesh out, are these anxieties economic? Are they about social power? Are they about just the kind of bipolar, multipolar, and unipolar system? But also, what do these anxieties tell us about the underlying American autobiography that the rising powers might challenge? And so you mentioned a couple of pieces of that autobiography, but I'm going to suggest some others for you to consider. So the US hegemony is being the triumph of the good versus evil, historically. US being exceptional, obviously. US self-reflexive identity of a benign hegemon, and how the rise of other hegemons may be malign. I guess that's the alternative. The US lifting the world from various global tyrannies. So these are parts, discrete parts of the American autobiography, how America understands itself. So can that be part of your story? And if not, which other parts of American autobiography are being challenged or being reinterpreted in the construction of the rising powers phenomenon? And for Elizaveta's paper, which is here, yes. So similarly then, I would ask, what did we learn about contemporary Russia from the way it historicizes and constructs the fascist other, which is everybody from the EU to Ukraine to everybody, which I really enjoyed reading. I also thought it was so ironic that it's the external fascism that securitized and not the domestic actual fascist practices that Putin is engaging in. But what did we learn about contemporary Russian polity that we did not know before? What does your understanding of the way in which fascism is used tells us where Russia is today? What does it understand? Again, what are parts of it autobiography? What does it understand? Does it understand itself to be the benign hegemon or the benevolent empire or spreading a particular worldview globally or expansionist? What is it? That we can then try to understand the contemporary Russian worldview that explains its narrative practices. And then for Dominica's paper, similarly, I was struck by, in the beginning of the paper, you mentioned that Poland historically considered itself to be on the borderlands of Christianity. And I just laughed out loud, because if I had $1 for every country that considers itself to be on the borderlands of Christianity, or dinar, I would be incredibly wealthy. So I was just writing down, Serbia is on the borderlands of Christianity, so is Croatia, so is Hungary, so is Romania, so is Bulgaria. Russia. Where is this border? It's like the big words large, and what is it about being on the border? Yeah, I didn't want to even go there. I'll leave that to you. What is it about this being a border of Christianity that really is obsessing people? And it's just, I find this, it's kind of a self-identifier that every country's autobiography has to start with. I am a defender on the borderline of Christianity. So this is amazing to me. But related to that then, how does this memory of the Golden Age play into Poland's self-understanding and its identity? And Ayse asked that earlier in the previous panel, during the Golden Age, Poles, did they think of themselves as being in the Golden Age? Or is this a contemporary construction of the past? And if it is, which I'm assuming that it is, my gut tells me that this is an invented tradition and an invented historical construction, then what purpose does it serve? Why is it important for Poland to have a Golden Age? What does it gain by that? Why is it important to have this fantastic political system? Is it to differentiate itself against others who are not as perfect? And who these others are, and for what political purpose? And then, even though your paper is historical and doesn't really talk about contemporary use of this narrative, I wonder if you could tell us what it is. What is the contemporary Polish view of the Golden Age? And then related to that, what is contemporary Polish view of its role in the international system, its EU power, its rising power within the EU, its kind of success story of Eastern Europe, and how does that then relate to this very romantic view of its past? Thank you.
We clap for that.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Jelena. And maybe just to contribute to your dilemma of the word, the uniquization you said.
Yes.
In my long journey from the unique case study of Israel to the unique case study of Serbia, very unique, I came to think of de-exceptionalization when we think of comparative politics. So maybe it can help us. We have plenty of time, so I would like to suggest, if okay with the panelists, that we go one round if you want to comment back to Jelena's comments, and then we can open it to our audience for additional questions.
Okay, so thank you, Jelena. My plan is actually to study different periods of hegemons and how they perceive the competitors or would-be threats. I mean, I use those words with some hesitation because I think they're historically contingent terms to some degree. But yeah, so I want to look at how the US, for instance, perceived the rise of Japan, and then go back even further and look at other power holders and their, and hopefully get out of modernity as well. But by doing that, I can answer some of the questions I think that you raised. Like, what does this tell us about American anxieties? I think you need to have some points of comparison in order to make claims about the present. So I will try to do it. I haven't done it yet. It's my short answer.
Thank you for your comments. Actually, it's really true that by looking at the discourses of others, we can learn a lot about the actual identity of the person who's uttering those narratives. And it's true that fascism is one of the quintessential others in current Russian discourse that helps to put Russians on the right side of history, so to say. So Russia, as the country who fought against fascism, makes it exceptional. It makes it the country that defeated fascism, and everybody else was sort of on the periphery. Americans, they were somewhere in the Pacific. They didn't really participate. The Europeans gave everything away. So it was more like the Russia that spearheaded the victory over fascism. So this is the ultimate narrative. So this kind of a self-inflation, this kind of psychological need to define yourself as a good one in the fight, so to say. So it's a kind of a knight in shiny armor trope, to use Ayse's popular culture references. And also regarding the borderland, also Russia considers itself also as a borderland, as this kind of beacon of the last beacon of Christianity as well, actually, especially in the last years. So it's again this trope that helps to enhance your own standing in the world. So it's the only country that tries to counter the American expansionism, the European expansionism. So it's the kind of again, this fortress, as maybe siege mentality that helps to mobilize the internal politics as well. So if you're under siege from this others, from the fascist others from outside, that's what helps you mobilize the internal politics as well. And as your question about the worldview, I would say that Russia is trying to portray itself as not as a hegemon. It's probably not trying to expand. But it's more about this sphere of influence, as was also noted in the keynote as well. That's one of the key factors that Russia has, is the sphere of influence. And now when it's losing it, it's also an existential threat to its ontological security, also to its understanding of it as being this great power. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you for the comments. What is about being a bulwark? That strikes me, because I think that it might be, I think I'm trying to imagine an answer. I think that in the case of Poland, being a bulwark, first of all, gave a role to Polish nation, and that you have a role within an national society. I think that you are much more important if you have a role that that make you defend some other nations from a tyranny of Asian politics, and it makes you the nation responsible for their fate, for it, let's say. So I think that it's regarding ourselves as a nation being a bulwark or of anything makes us feel much more important, and gives us even in as for our self-concept the conviction of our power and our place in the society of states. Well, the second question, why Golden Age, and what does it, where does it help to consider ourselves as we are, and if it is the invented tradition or if Schlachta regarded themselves as being in the Golden Age at the time. I think that that it might be said that the Schlachta exactly regarded as being in the very special moment of Polish history, when Polish state was a powerful one. And I think that these convictions of their magnificence, their exceptional political systems, is exactly the what we today call the Golden Age. And as for the invented tradition, of course, the name or the term of Polish Golden Age was coined today, but I think that it is the case of what I said at the beginning, that it is the last such successful period in Polish history, and even at the personal level, one has to have something to look behind as something good, what happened to us, to me, or anything. Well, regarding the contemporary use of the memory of the Polish Golden Age, this is, I think, much more complicated, because this historical memory is changing. There is, of course, a continuation of the influence or the use of this historical memory. And what can I say? I think the best example is the myth of this eastern borderlands, lost eastern borderlands. Firstly, lost after the Great War, then the rest of the eastern borderlands has been lost after the Second World War, and it is connected with this civilizing mission of Poland, which we had on the east of the Europe. And it gives to Polish people that sense of responsibility for the nations of the East, for Ukrainians, for Belarusians, for maybe not today Lithuanians, but I think as for Ukraine, it is. It might be simply visible as for the partnership for the East, which we try to foster, and so on. So it is not at this level as of the research as the first part, but I think I just give it a try to answer your question.
Thank you very much. I think we have time to take about 3 comments or questions from the audience and have another round of answers.
Thank you, Hans Moritzen. I would ask, it's a question mainly to Dominika, and it's generally when we in memory studies we sometimes tend to overestimate the significance of memories, but therefore it could be interesting to hear how much how memory competes with other concerns. For instance, when Pilsudski launched this war that you mentioned, this Polish-Soviet war, I mean, I know nothing about that, so it's just out of curiosity. I want to know: have you studied the documents, the historical documents? Have you seen, I mean, Pilsudski's incentives to launch this war? I mean, was that only because of his fantastic memories? I can see those memories as a legitimizing factor, of course, but behind the facade, have you any impression whether did he have a certain more contemporary concerns than the historical past?
Yeah. Additional questions?
Sonja Stojanović-Gajić, Belgrade Center for Security Policy. It's a more rhetorical question. Listening to second panel and first panel, I was just wondering why we didn't have any researchers studying small states, you know, or the countries that dare to identify small states apply to discuss politics of memory. I'm just interested if there is anything different in dynamics of, you know, considering yourself great, whether it's US, Russia, Poland, Serbia, or whatever, or use of memory in those that consider themselves small.
Small nations are found.
Thank you very much for excellent presentations. I have a question for Elizaveta. You mostly studied the Russia's references to fascism and to collective memories. Have you studied Ukrainians' references to collective memories and to recent or more distant past, and what these references are actually doing for contemporary security policy and the anti-terror campaign? Thank you.
Any additional question? We can take one more, maybe. No. Okay. I'll let you answer, please.
Okay, so I will start. If I understood your question well, it was about why Piłsudski headed to the war beside this historical memory justification. What I've read is that Piłsudski considered Poland very close, much closer to the Europe than to the Russia. And his goal was to build a really strong country which would be able to confront with such giant. First, he wanted to be able to confront with Tsarist Russia and the political system of Tsarist Russia has been perceived by Piłsudski as the strong threat towards the whole Europe. Then, after the 1917, he also perceived this way the Bolshevism. So that is why this war was of such importance to Piłsudski. I hope it's a sufficient answer.
Actually, I will try to address all three questions because they're kind of related a little bit. So you mentioned the legitimatory power of memory, and in this case, in Russia, it actually works really well because this kind of memory of fascism is a certain legitimacy factor for intervening in Ukraine. And when Putin signed in the law to apply Russian troops in eastern Ukraine, that was the legitimacy for it, was the memory of fascism. And as for smaller countries, actually there's a wonderful project called Memory at War, and they actually studied also Serbian memories of Ratko Mladic, for example. So there are also this kind of projects that are dealing with smaller countries, so to say, but So in any case, there is research that is directed to that area as well. And as for Ukrainian question, I mostly concentrated on the Russian networks, but there is also there's a paper about the memory of Stepan Bandera in Ukraine. So a lot of Ukrainian collective memory about the Second World War is very polarized. So it's either extremely pro Stepan Bandera, who actually participated on the German side in the Great Patriotic War, and in the Soviet historiography was branded as a fascist, as a Nazi collaborator, pogroms, all those things that come into play. And that's one of the reasons that the Russians actually called the proponents of the European integration, or the people who were in Western Ukraine, who live in Western Ukraine, they call them Banderovites, Banderi. That's the kind of memory of fascism that exists in Ukraine, but it's very polarized. So if you look at the Eastern Ukraine, there are a lot of people who will call Bandera a fascist, and so this is very, very much kind of East-West divides, unfortunately, and there's no kind of consensus like it is in Russia right now, for example, more overwhelming consensus that is in Russia. So, yeah.
Yeah, there were no questions directed at me, but as for the small countries question, I mean, small is in some ways a matter of, you know, it's a mindset, right? So if we're just judging by size or population, I'd say Serbia and Croatia do qualify as small countries, but it's, you know, it's not that. I mean, it's what a country imagines itself to be, which is a much more complicated question than just population and resources. So for instance, Turkey imagines itself a much greater power than South Korea, but if you look at material indicators, South Korea will best Turkey in every regard, but the foreign policy doesn't reflect this. Or India had a much smaller foreign policy until recently, until this government, than its size would warrant. So I think we are studying that question. It's just not a very obvious question. I mean, it's not a question that has an obvious answer, is what I would say.
Well, what Ayse said. So, yeah, everything. But also, I mean, there is something about self-identifying as a small state, which I think is interesting. But again, I mean, it's much more common to project your power out of your small size. It's much more common to project yourself as grand, even if your size is small, than to project yourself as small, even if your size is larger. And so I'm thinking, so it's very rare actually to see countries that self-identify as small, not important, non-relevant, with pathetic foreign policy interest, and kind of want to stay out of everybody's business. Norway's not a small state. You have oil. That doesn't count. Slovenia may be one that I'm thinking of, where it actually self-identifies as small and has some issues about its smallness that can reflect some of its foreign policy behavior. But I think it's completely in a self-projection of your own worth and of your own value. It's not in any measurable statistic.
I would just add another thought in the meeting point of memory and conflict studies, as we know in the meeting point of conflict studies and memory studies, of course, we have those everlasting conflicts in some very small countries, and so there is no correlation between the amount of literature we have available or the discussions and the actual size. But I don't think that's originally what you actually meant in your comment. Okay, so I think we are 20 minutes to 2. I would like to thank again to all our panelists for your papers.